Book 30 of 2020 was White Like Me by Tim Wise. So the reason why I bought this book on Audible was because it was more prominently advertised due to the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I thought that it was really important at that time to educate myself about this movement, particularly about things like white privilege, because I was a little bit, I would say resistant, because I feel like I might have been uninformed about it, and this book really helped to inform me more so that I understood more what that meant. So it was very useful for that reason. I think if you're someone who maybe gets offended by the term white privilege or doesn't think that it's a valid thing, I would definitely recommend this book, because it definitely educated me more into it so that I now understand what it means and am for it. Wise, what he does is he uses his own experiences in his life as examples of whiteness and how they have allowed him beneficial privileges that if he wasn't white he wouldn't have had. And I think they were really useful for someone who's white to understand what it means by privilege. So Wise uses these to kind of deconstruct institutional racism. I think people are aware that there's institutional racism. They have an awareness that things are unfair in terms of like the police and how they're treated in terms of like stop and search and stuff like that, excuse me. But I think there's other things that go on that I don't think that white people generally know about. I'm using kind of, you know, sweeping generalizations here. White people, I don't know every white person. I'm not being a voice for every white person, but I'm kind of almost like talking about myself, I guess. I'll go into more detail in a minute. Essentially, being white grants you privileges. I think the term white privilege is a little bit contentious because it almost kind of suggests that you have privilege as in totality, so that you have, I guess, you know, wealth maybe. But obviously if you're a white person and you aren't wealthy and you don't feel privileged, then you might think that that term's a little bit like it doesn't really apply to you, so you're a bit confused maybe. Or this was my experience of it. I was a bit like, am I privileged? Like, am I, like, because I don't feel like I am, because, you know, in comparison to other people, they're wealthier than I am, they have more material things than I do, so am I privileged? But I think what this book does is it explains in the way that white is a privilege. And it's things like, you know, you are born into a majority and you're born kind of belonging to that. You don't kind of feel othered, and your culture's not othered, and, you know, you are kind of like the norm. And you feel like you have a deserved place anywhere. You can go into any space and be comfortable there and not ever feel that you have to think about your race in spaces. Like that, you don't have to do that. Whereas somebody who is black or of colour is more aware of that in a kind of similar way to, you know, this is not really comparable, but this is kind of how I kind of understand it a little bit. As a female, it's very different experience as to what it is as a male. So for example, you know, females can't go into certain spaces because they'd be unsafe, and so that's always kind of on a female's mind, but that might not be something that males are aware of. And, you know, males have privilege in that sense that they don't have to think about, oh, I can't walk down that street because it's not well lit, because I'm probably going to get sexually attacked or something, you know. And obviously a man can still get attacked, but it's more prominent on a woman's mind, I would say. So in a sense like that, I can kind of understand how somebody who's black or of colour might have other thoughts about other things in other spaces that I probably don't think of. So it's kind of a little, it helps me to kind of empathise, like just comparing those two, even though they're not the same. And Wise kind of goes into history to kind of explain this a little bit more. So he talks about post-war, when whites were privileged by giving them land grants and blacks weren't given land grants for like rewards for, you know, fighting in the war. So there was discrimination there, which means, you know, it has the consequence of that white people then can accumulate wealth and then pass that down into generations. And so there's kind of lineage there where you benefit from inherited wealth, which people who are black and of colour might not necessarily be able to privilege from inherited wealth, because their ancestors might have been slaves, and so they didn't have any material wealth to kind of pass down. There's no kind of contact between families because they were torn apart, and also because of the discrimination. So for example, with the post-war grants, land grants, they weren't given that ability to kind of make something of themselves. Things like advertising lynchings in newspapers, and whites were encouraged to check the passes of black people to check that they weren't runaway slaves. So all of the things in history were kind of geared towards making black people kind of like othering them, so that they weren't kind of part of society, which obviously explains where this kind of othering comes from and this kind of racism comes from, because it was part of white supremacy, in history. And things like immigration laws as well were discriminatory because they benefited and privileged the people that could integrate and assimilate better into places. So for example, if they were more white looking, they were more likely to be privileged because they could assimilate and integrate better. So there's lots of things that kind of discriminated against black people. So systemically in history there's been a lot of discrimination and a lot of treating black people differently than white people. And what I was mentioning before about the kind of inherited wealth and the kind of systemic issues that has, Wise gives his own example where, because of his grandparents having wealth, they could use that as collateral to help his education and go towards his education. Now if you are a person who hasn't got that inherited wealth, then you can't do that. So you can never kind of educate your children and get them to be better than what you are, and so on and so forth, all the way up, because you can't get there, you've got no collateral. So it's almost like keeping people stuck in a kind of certain place, just in a similar way to how class keeps you stuck. But obviously, if you're discriminated by just the colour of your skin, it's very different, isn't it? You can't really change that or do anything about that, whereas your class you could change, you can do something about that. Things as well like where people live. So in America there's a thing called redlining, which means that if you're black, you're not allowed to live in certain areas, you're discriminated against. And they don't necessarily say this to you, they'll just say, oh, you've not been, your references haven't come through, or you've not been allowed to go there for, they'll make up some reason or whatever, so that it doesn't seem like it's racist, but it actually is. So you can't live in certain areas. So what tends to happen is that in America, black people were made to live in certain areas which were lower standard, higher crime. Being around that kind of situation and that kind of environment is not going to exactly do you any favours in your own life. It's not going to be a very safe place for you to live, and there's more chance of becoming embroiled in kind of what's going on around. And the other thing is as well that as a white person, so to take this kind of like back to white privilege, as a white person, you have inherited wealth. You have, well, not everybody obviously, but your parents have probably benefited from something in their family that's kind of been passed down. Not all the time, but majority of the time you inherit kind of like houses and whatever, or someone died in the family and you get to buy it cheap, something like that. But as a white person, you wouldn't kind of get segregated into a certain area based on the colour of your skin. It would depend more upon kind of like whether you could afford it or not. So black people who could afford to live there were still not allowed to live there. Like, it's discrimination, it shouldn't have happened. Similarly, as a white person, you're not really in danger of being displaced because of gentrification. So because the area is deemed to be not very nice and needs redeveloping, what tends to happen is they get rid of all the people, they redevelop it, they make it really, really expensive, and then the people that lived there originally can't then go back in there because they can't afford it. So you're kind of displacing people all the time. So people's communities are getting broken up, which, as you know, as a white person, you probably wouldn't have, you know, had to suffer that. Your whole community is not getting kind of like dismantled because it's part of the other. Wise also uses experience of whiteness to explain how it's probably very different, and his life would have been very different if he'd have been black. So he talks about when he was at college and he was at a party and everyone was drinking, underage drinking, and you know, they were smoking weed, and a police officer came round and all that they did was tell them to turn the music down. Now you can imagine if that was, I didn't speak properly out there. You can imagine if that was a party where there was black people there, that they would have got done for possession of drugs, underage drinking, and would have been kind of put into the criminal justice system. So, I mean, it might not have done, but the odds are that that's probably likely to be what would have happened. Similarly, Wise says that, you know, being white affords you the opportunity to take risks. So he kind of like created fake IDs, which is obviously against the law. Like he had a friend that was drug dealing. You know, if you are a black person, you wouldn't take those risks because you know that you are more likely to get caught. So you have a privilege of being white that if you do get in trouble with the police, you'll probably just get a warning, you'll get away with it, you know, a slap on the wrist or whatever. Whereas if you're a black person, you're in the criminal justice system, you know, they're not going to be as kind of lenient with you just because of the colour of your skin. Similarly, Wise talks about an experience where he locked his keys in his car and he was trying to break into his own car to get his keys, and a police officer drove past and offered to help him break into the car without asking for any identification or, you know, proof that the car is his. Just kind of looked at him and judged based on what he looked like that it was his car and helped him into it. Now, imagine if it was a black person trying to get his own keys out of his car, would the police respond in the same way? I think it's very unlikely that they would. Another example that Wise uses as kind of like a comparison was that there was a white woman that was mugged by a black man, and the police stopped an innocent black man who was in the area without, you know, reading rights or anything like that, just kind of arrest him straight away. And only let him go. Like, so they'd taken this man to the woman and the woman said that wasn't him. They still wouldn't let him go. And they only let him go when they realised that he was related to another police officer. And then they let him go. It's like absolutely crazy. And then Wise also talks as well about his academic performance was really low, but because he was white, he was privileged and given, you know, extra, like he was put into an exceptional stream of a class in his school, but yet there was only white people in there and he wasn't academically gifted, so it made absolutely no sense as to why he was in it. So there was clear discrimination there. And also there were kind of recruitments from universities coming into his college, recruitment, because it's different in America, isn't it? Recruitment from colleges coming into his school, and yet this college, get confused because in my head it's like school and college, but at university and then university, but then in America it's high school and college. But anyway, basically the college that he went to, they'd come a really long distance to recruit him, and he isn't academically gifted, and there was a high school down the road from them that was a black high school, majority black high school, and they didn't recruit there. So there's kind of clear, you know, problems with how they recruit him. And also he talks about when he challenged authority. So there's a couple of examples of when he challenged authority. And again, he says that, you know, he's never had to worry about being minimised on account of his race. He's been allowed to speak politically. He's been allowed to fight for social justice without kind of somebody going, oh, it's because of the race. Like, you know, it's not even a question. So overall, Wise kind of gives a lot of examples of how him being white has privileged him as an individual, and kind of gets you to think about your own whiteness and how that has privileged you. Because I think the problem with the term privilege is that it makes you think that you've got some benefit when you might think that it's not a benefit. I mean, it is a benefit, but what I'm saying is that we take these things as a given. So we think of these things as like a human right to like be given a fair and equal chance in education, to not be discriminated against, to be given protection from police, to be be given the benefit of the doubt. Like, we take these as a given and as a human right, but these things aren't given to people who are black and of colour. So it's like almost like they haven't got it. So it's almost like to say that you have white privilege when really it's a white human right, but it's not a white human right, it's just a human right, but black people and people of colour don't have it. That's why it's a little bit like odd to say kind of like white privilege is a bit like, but if you actually look at the definition of privilege is to say that one kind of group of people has something beneficial that another group perhaps doesn't, and so in that sense it does actually make sense to use that term. So for me, this book really helps me understand what white privilege is, and to understand that I do have white privilege, and that I have had an easier life because I'm white. I think the problem is as well, like, I'm in quite an echo chamber, so I don't know of anybody that's suffered discrimination in education or suffered discrimination at the hands of the police or anything like that. So because I'm not aware of it happening, and I have friends that are black and of colour, but it's never come up in conversation, it's never kind of, I've never been made aware of it. And so for me it was kind of like, is this really happening, is it still going on? And this is a conversation about America in this book, and I wondered if it was just an American thing, but I've read another book since that I'm going to do a review on, which is showing that it's in the UK as well, and it's so strange to not be kind of aware of it and aware that it's kind of happening. And so it's really important to read books like these to understand that institutional racism is a real thing. People who are black and of colour are getting discriminated against on a regular basis, and you need to be an ally to fight against racism, because it's not right. Like, it's against human rights. And for me, like, I don't kind of view people based on their race. And I know that people get almost kind of mocked for saying that they don't see people's colour or race or whatever, and I think the people that say that are saying it in a kind of good intentioned way of, they see race and colour in the same way that they see hair colour and eye colour, and whether you wear glasses and whether you've got a hoodie on or a suit on or whatever, it's viewed in a kind of similar way, because you are treating everybody equally. But I understand that it's important to recognise that it's a difference, because then you can recognise if people are being discriminated against. So I see both sides on that, but I wouldn't mock either side, because I think both have kind of valid viewpoints. I think the problem is that this doesn't really get spoken about in a conversation. It's very much a kind of like, I don't know, people saying, oh, you've got white privilege, and then people saying, oh, white privilege doesn't exist or whatever. And it's like there's no kind of actual conversation to say what it actually means and what people's experiences of it are. I think this was really useful that it was written by someone who was white, because they are demonstrating how their whiteness has had a benefit, and then it makes it easier to see, rather than just being told that you have it and not really understanding kind of why. And I'm vaguely intelligent, and it was something that I had to kind of like learn about. So I think it's important to kind of educate yourself and read things like this. I have actually read another book from a black perspective, so I'll review that in another book review. That one's Natives by Akala, I think it's called. So that'll be coming up soon. So overall, I gave this 3 out of 5 stars, because I really liked the analytical kind of discussion of it, and obviously because it's changed my opinions about things. Not changed my opinion, but kind of informed me more. But I did think that it was very heavy on the memoir, and it was a lot about Tim Wise's life rather than kind of discussing the actual topic. So I would have preferred less of his life, but he does acknowledge that in his foreword when he's kind of like looked back over it and discussed it. So I still liked it, and it's still worth a read.